Desiree Nixon here for my first ever Dewpoint Des podcast. This first episode is going to be talking about all of the recent insane weather events that we've been having. I personally think that all of these weather events are directly related to global warming and climate change, but some of the most crucial people in our country unfortunately do not. So today we are going to be talking about all the events that have happened, then why I think that global warming and climate change are the cause of the events, and finally, some of the policies that have been put forth and taken away when talking about this issue. However, I understand that I am one of the few people in the country that loves talking about climate change and global warming as much as I do, so I'm going to be breaking up my conversation with some of my favorite weather-related songs. I know, cheesy, huh? But before we start talking about everything that's going on, I wanted to get us pumped up to listen to this amazing podcast with a new song from Imagine Dragons. The song title is Thunder, so based upon the title, it seems like everyone is going to get shocked. So without further ado, here is Thunder by Imagine Dragons.
Just a young gun with a quick fuse. I was uptight, wanna let loose. I was dreaming of bigger things and wanna leave my old life behind. Not a yes sir, not a follower. Fit the box, fit the mold, have a seat in the foyer. Take a number. I was lightning before the thunder.
Thunder, 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 thunder,
Thunder, feel the thunder. Lightning and the thunder. Thunder, feel the thunder. Lightning and the thunder. Thunder.
Thunder. Oh, okay. I didn't realize that this mic was back on. I know you guys didn't come here to hear me sing because I am an absolutely awful singer, so let's go ahead and start talking about the events that have been going on. 2 weeks ago, on August 25th to 29th, Texas braced for what was one of the most devastating natural disasters to ever hit them, Hurricane Harvey. Hurricane Harvey was one of the first major hurricanes to hit Texas since Cecilia in 1970. It hit Texas at a Category 4 and has left a death toll of 70 and continues to rise with each day. Texas is still in natural disaster state and has had to have $10 billion allotted to them from FEMA. I mention that amount because it becomes kind of important when we're talking about some of the policies that have been revoked. Not only have they had to have government money given to them, but there's also been many donations from celebrities, and somebody I'll mention a little later on, Leonardo DiCaprio, was one of the hosts of a hand-in-hand telethon for Harvey relief. It's just amazing how much money we've had to spend with Harvey. If all the money that we were spending for Harvey and all the deaths and every devastating thing that we had with Harvey, apparently Mother Nature didn't think that that was enough. So, right after Hurricane Harvey hit, Hurricane Irma was brewing. It was brewing off the coast of Florida in the Atlantic, and it spent 37 hours at Category 5 state. Now, if you know anything about hurricanes or hurricane history, then you'll know that that is the longest amount ever that a hurricane has been at a Category 5 state. So that's pretty insane. Although it didn't hit Florida at a Category 5, it did hit many islands and left complete devastation. At a Category 5, it wasn't just an average-sized Category 5. It was nearly double the size of Andrew. Whenever Andrew hit in 1992, it was big and massive and caused many deaths and billions upon billions of dollars in damage, but it was smaller than Irma. And I've attached some photos here. It's going to break through my little logo I have, and you can see that it is nearly double the size. Irma was nearly double the size of what Hurricane Andrew was, and that is insane, and that is a direct sign of global warming and climate change, and I'll explain why here in a minute. So, we had Harvey, we had Irma, and apparently Mother Nature didn't think we had enough, so then we have Hurricane Jose. Right after Hurricane Irma was done, Florida has had to start to worry about if Hurricane Jose is going to come to them, because Hurricane Jose at one time was a Category 4 hurricane. For there to be two Category 4s and a Category 5 hurricane, within this 2-week period, it is incredibly insane. Currently, scientists don't even know where Jose is looking to go, so we can only hope that it doesn't, brew more out in the Atlantic and come hit Florida or Texas, for that matter, when they're trying to clean up from all the devastation that they've been having. Now, while all these vicious hurricanes have been ramping through the ocean, there has been a massive wildfire that's been roaring through Montana. And this wildfire has been happening since the beginning of August. The New York Times and the Washington Post had started to post articles, and it really hasn't been on mainstream media because it's just been going on for so long. It was on the media for the first week, but it's still going on right now. And it is so devastating in Montana and North Dakota area. The air quality is so bad that the EPA has had to issue an air quality alert for North Dakota. Now, we haven't just had these crazy events here in the United States. In fact, last week in Mexico, they had an 8.1 magnitude earthquake. An 8.1 magnitude earthquake. Now that is of historic proportions. They've had hundreds of deaths from it. It is scary what's going on with Earth right now. To me, I see it as a puzzle. We have the first event of the fire, and then we have Harvey, and then we have Irma, and now we have Jose, and we have the earthquake. A huge, devastating puzzle that's called climate change and called global warming. What else would be causing this? We had an El Nino year. I get that. I understand what that means, and I'm going to go ahead and explain it here in a minute. But that should not be causing all of this. Everything that's happening isn't because of just El Nino. And whenever any journalist or reporter tries to bring this up to the government, and you can hear this from a soundbite from our EPA director, a journalist asked him if he thought that climate change was a contributor to the hurricanes and natural disasters that we've been having, and you can hear his answer.
In an interview with CNN Thursday, Environmental Protection Agency head Scott Pruitt called it insensitive to mention climate change in discussions about Hurricane Harvey and Hurricane Irma.
Insensitive. Did you hear that? Scott Pruitt, the administrator of the EPA, says that it's insensitive to discuss climate change in the midst of deadly storms. Insensitive. To me, that's baffling. If we would have been talking about this whenever we had the chance, if we would have been talking about this whenever it got brought up in the early 2000s, we wouldn't have to be having these insensitive conversations. And I'm going to go ahead and give you some evidence as to why we should have been dealing with this issue way before now, and then we wouldn't have to deal with this quote, insensitive topic. So if any of you on here follow climate change, follow global warming, then you've heard a few names brought up when talking about this. One of the first names is Al Gore. Former vice president. He ran for president in 2000, and there was a highly contested election. Bush ended up winning. He didn't stop his fight, and we're going to talk about him. And another name that always comes up is Leonardo DiCaprio. He's a famous actor, recently won an Oscar for The Revenant. He is a huge advocate for climate change and global warming. And I mentioned him earlier. He was one of the hosts of the Hand in Hand telethon, and his main purpose was to raise awareness of global warming and climate change. But we'll get into him a little bit later. We're going to hit on Al Gore. And right after he lost the election against Bush, he didn't want to not have his voice heard. So he went around the country giving a PowerPoint presentation, and this was when PowerPoint was just getting big. It was in the early 2000s, and he would give this presentation about climate change and global warming. Everyone really liked his presentation, so he decided to make a book about it, and the book is called An Inconvenient Truth: The Planetary Emergency of Global Warming and What We Can Do About It. He published the book in 2006 as well as a documentary film. The documentary won an Oscar. It had some shocking things in the book. Everything was backed up by scientists, and one of the main things that he said was that we were going to be getting massive hurricanes. And to quote the book, he says, "As the oceans get warmer, storms get stronger. In 2004, Florida was hit by 4 unusually powerful hurricanes." Now, that was in 2004. He was speaking about this in 2020. 2006. And that was 11 years ago. If we would have been listening to what's in this book, we could have prevented issues that we're having today, like Harvey. And you may think, how in the world can this girl, Desiree, how can she say that the oceans are warming because of climate change and global warming, and that's causing hurricanes based on one quote by a guy who has no scientific credentials at all? Well, I can't say that. That wouldn't be right. That would be, quote, quote, fake news. So, I'm not going to just use Al Gore's statement. In fact, I'm going to use multiple statements from multiple different government organizations. We have NASA, we have NOAA, we have the National Weather Service, we have the American Meteorological Society that all say, as the oceans get warmer, hurricanes get stronger, hurricanes get more frequent, and I can quote directly from Climate Studies, an introduction to climate science. It has a lot of stuff in it. And one of the most influential chapters to me was chapter 10, and it talks about how climatology and climate change relate to severe weather. One of the main things that it talks about is hurricanes, because there are 3 conditions necessary for a tropical cyclone to form: high sea surface temperature, adequate Coriolis effect, and weak winds aloft. So, Coriolis effect, I've attached a graphic here. It is the refraction and distortion of winds throughout the world. Winds will flow one way in our part of the world and a totally opposite way in another part of the world. You've probably heard about the whole toilet thing in Australia. The toilets flush the opposite way in Australia, and that's incredibly true. And that is because of Coriolis effect. The winds are completely opposite, and you have to have that opposite wind in order to form a hurricane, meaning hurricanes can't form on the equator because there's no Coriolis. So that's the first ingredient necessary to form a hurricane. And the second is weak winds aloft. Okay, weak winds aloft have to do with, the air in the atmosphere, and we don't have a whole lot of control of it. It changes with El Nino and La Nina, and that's really how that is affected. And the other one is high sea surface temperature. And that happens to be the most important ingredient of all of those 3 ingredients in the formation of hurricanes, because the temperature governs the rate of evaporation of the water. So a higher sea surface temperature means the greater supply of energy for the storm system. NOAA, the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration, actually tests sea surface temperature, and I've attached a picture of it right here. As you can see, we have a thick band around our country and around other parts of the world of this orangish color. That orangish color is higher sea surface temperatures than average. And just by that, you can see that we have a significant warming. That warming is a direct relation of global warming and climate change. I've attached NASA's quick little explanation of what global warming is and why we are the cause of it, and it's because of the greenhouse effect. The greenhouse effect is an effect that we have to live on the earth. If we didn't have it, we'd freeze to death. But whenever we have too much of it, we will burn to death, which is kind of what is happening right now. We get too much greenhouse gases in this thin blue layer around the earth, and that traps in more heat from the sun, and that is what is warming the oceans, melting the ice caps, and in turn causing more hurricanes. I've mentioned NASA in this order because I wanted to bring up another celebrity, Leonardo DiCaprio. I've mentioned him before in this podcast, and it's because he is an important person when you are talking about climate change and global warming. He recently produced Before the Flood. It's an amazing documentary. It informs you of what's going on. One of the things that people didn't like about Al Gore's documentary, and that I combated with this podcast, is Al Gore has no credentials to be talking about climate change and global warming. Luckily, he does his research and he gets evidence from NASA, NOAA, all those agencies, but he never really directly has them talk about it. That's one thing that in Before the Flood, Leonardo DiCaprio did. He went to a NASA astronaut and had him talk about everything that's going on. So I'm going to go ahead and play the clip really quick so you guys can see what I'm talking about instead of me just rambling about it.
Here's an example of one thing we can see. This is ocean surface temperature as measured from space. This is the whole world's surface temperature. You can see the poles melting there.
Wow.
Yeah. This is the way to do it, man. I mean, this is the way to really see what's going on. Here's a Gulf Stream. Look at this. This is the motion of the ocean.
This is like a great piece of art.
It is, isn't it? Biggest impact will be here.
In the Gulf Stream.
Yeah. This current here, is it? The dumping of ice off melting Greenland would stop this conveyor.
Now, as you can see, this NASA astronaut is very vocal in his thoughts. He understands what's happening, and he showed the graphic I was just talking about global warming and the sea surface temperature, and you can see it is happening. It's there. It's real. It is the cause of these massive hurricanes, but we aren't really doing anything about it. I decided to go ahead and end on, Leonardo DiCaprio with the sea surface temperature and before the flood, because it brings up a main point that we have to talk about in this podcast, and that's the Paris Climate Accord. Now, if you watch the documentary, it's solely based upon the Paris Climate Accord because Leonardo DiCaprio was the messenger of peace at the summit, and it follows his journey in talking about the issue and everything that he thinks that we should do to combat it. Before I talk about what's in the agreement, I wanted to talk about the fact that we pulled out of it. We pulled out of the Paris Agreement on June 1st of this past year, and I'm going to go ahead and show the clip of Trump talking about why he thought that we should pull out of it.
The United States will withdraw from the Paris Climate Accord, but begin negotiations to re-enter either the Paris Accord or in really entirely new transaction on terms that are fair to the United States, its businesses, its workers, its people, its taxpayers. So we're getting out.
All right. So the economy. He's a Republican president. He got put into office because he's a billionaire and he knows how to run the economy. So whenever people hear him say that it's bad for the economy, they believe, well, that must be true. I mean, he knows about economics. He knows how to make money. He's worth $3 billion. Well, the funny thing is that we just spent, I mentioned this at the beginning of this podcast, we just had to allot Texas $10 billion from FEMA, okay? We haven't even allotted Florida any money yet. We haven't allotted the U.S. Virgin Islands any money yet. So we just started this whole relief for all of these natural disasters, and we're at $10 billion. The Paris Climate Agreement was only going to cost the United States $2 billion a year. Like he said multiple times, it was going to cost us billions and billions and billions of dollars. No, it wasn't. It was us and 5 nations who were going to help the other nations that don't have the funds go straight to green energy instead of going through all of the coal. And he pulled us out of it. But now, Governor Rick Scott of Florida has been heard saying that it might be important to try and join that agreement again. Might be important. Trump has been talking about going back to the agreement, which is just absolutely hilarious to me. Now, with all of that, you may be listening to this podcast and be like, why is she just telling me all of this negative information? Why is it just, we're going to have these massive storms until we decide to do something about it? Why am I saying all this? Well, I'm saying all of this and I'm talking about this because I truly believe that the politicians believe what the people believe. It was evident with Rick Scott and the Paris Agreement. Rick Scott has not allotted money to Miami. Miami has been a disaster because of global warming. The ocean temperatures are so high that the water is rising significant amounts. Miami has had to rebuild its city higher so that it doesn't get flooded by the ocean. And it's not getting federal or state funding from it. They're having to spend their own city funding to help rebuild their city. Rick Scott had no interest in talking about climate change or giving them funding at all until Irma. Until the Floridians started asking why. They started wondering, what is this? Why is this happening? What have we done? Is this Armageddon? Why? What is going on? So now he's like, oh great, maybe I should start doing something. Maybe I should address the issue of climate change. maybe this is really happening. And he is starting to pressure Trump to renegotiate the Paris Agreement. What we do, the people, we the people have the power to change the world. So I guess that's my little rant for the day. Little podcast, episode 1 here. So until my next episode, I am Desiree Nixon for Dewpoint Des Podcast.